Stagecoach left the fat girl behind in the wilderness. Mountain Man said, "Good, I need a wife." "Dump the weight or we don't make the pass," Hank Crowley barked, and 6 faces turned in the cramped stagecoach until every eye landed on Maeve Sullivan. Wind knifed down from the Rockies, tearing at the coach lamps and hurling sleet across the shale. The front wheel lay splintered like a broken rib. Beyond the road's ragged edge, the world dropped into a gorge of fur and shadow, where the San Miguel River boiled white. Maeve clutched her carpet-bag to her chest and shook her head. "Please," she said, the Irish lilt softening into a plea. "I've paid my fare. My uncle's waiting in California." "Then write him a letter from heaven," Hank said. He flung open the door, grabbed her wrist, and dragged her into the whirling cold. Boots crunching ice, passengers climbed out one by one, averting their eyes, muttering about schedules, about survival, about pounds and chances. Someone said she'd be fine if she kept walking west. Someone else said wolves favored late autumn. The coach groaned as men heaved the spare wheel aboard. Hank tossed her bag beside the ruts. "If you're lucky, another coach will come by," he said, and snapped the reins. The team lunged. The coach shrank into a smear of lantern light and then was gone, leaving only sleet and the raw scrape of wind. Maeve stood alone on the spine of the pass, the sky an iron lid, her breath torn thin. When the last echo of harness bells died, another sound rose from the timberline below, the steady, certain beat of a single horse. A figure climbed out of the dark, a big-shouldered rider wrapped in weathered hide, rifle slung low, eyes the color of river rock. He took in the broken wheel tracks, the abandoned bag, the girl shivering in green wool. "Good," he said, voice deep as the mountain itself. "I need a wife." The wind carved through the canyon, carrying with it the faint jingle of the stagecoach's chains long after it had vanished. Maeve Sullivan stood trembling in her heavy Irish shawl, her fingers white from clutching her carpet-bag. She was 20 years old, soft-faced and round-cheeked, with red hair that the snow kept trying to bury and eyes green like the moss that grows on old stones. For most of her life, people had looked at her and seen weight before they saw worth. When she left Dublin 2 years earlier, she thought the new world might be kinder. But the further west she went, the smaller her chances became, especially now, stranded between nowhere and nightfall. Her boots sank in slush as she turned in a slow circle. To the east stretched 50 miles of wilderness, to the west mountains that bit into the clouds. Somewhere in between she whispered, "God, please, send someone." The sound that answered her wasn't God, but hooves, steady, slow, deliberate. Josiah Brennan, called Joe by the few who knew him, reined his bay stallion at the sight of her. He looked like the mountain had built him. Tall, broad-shouldered, coat of tanned elk hide, dark hair tied back with a strip of leather. A rifle rested easy across his saddle, and a hunting knife hung from his belt. He studied her without speaking, not the way Hank Crowley had, calculating, cruel, but as if he were assessing weather, distance, consequence. "What are you doing out here alone?" he finally asked. His voice was gravel over warmth. "The coach." Maeve's throat caught. "They said I was too heavy. They left me." For a moment nothing moved, not the horse, not the trees, not even the air. Then Joe dismounted and walked toward her. "They left you to die for the sake of a broken wheel?" She nodded, eyes down. "I think so." He looked at her for a long time, then exhaled through his nose. half disbelief, half quiet fury. "Good," he said. "I need a wife." Her head jerked up. What?" Joe's mouth quirked, not quite a smile. "A wife. Been living up here too long. Cabin needs tending. Land needs a woman's hands. You need shelter, food, someone who won't leave you on the side of a road." Maeve stammered, "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he said simply. "You're still standing. That tells me what kind of woman you are." He offered his hand, calloused, steady. "Come on, mountain's dropping temperature fast. You can argue later." Maeve hesitated only a heartbeat before taking it. His palm closed around hers, rough but careful, like he was used to catching fragile things. As he lifted her onto his horse, she whispered, "And if I say no?" Joe swung up behind her, the warmth of him solid against her back. "Then I'll take you to town at first light," he said. "But for tonight, you'll live." The wind howled as they turned toward the peaks, two strangers bound by necessity and the faint spark of something neither could yet name. Snow began to fall as Josiah Brennan guided the horse along the narrow trail that wound upward through the pines. The animal's breath steamed in the freezing air. Maeve's did, too. Her shawl was soaked, her teeth clattered, but she kept her spine straight behind him, afraid to speak, afraid to breathe wrong. "Keep your head down," Joe said over his shoulder. His voice was calm, like he was talking to the wind itself. "Storm's moving in faster than I thought." She nodded, clutching her carpetbag to her chest. "How far?" "Couple hours, if the weather's kind." He paused. "And it won't be." The words carried no cruelty, only truth. Maeve looked around, at the walls of black forest closing in, at the white curtain beginning to veil the world. She had never felt smaller or more alive. By the time the last light bled from the sky, the storm had swallowed the trail. Joe stopped beneath a bluff, swung down from the saddle, and lifted Maeve off the horse as if she weighed nothing. He tied the reins to a low branch and said, "We'll rest here." Within minutes he had gathered fallen limbs, struck flint, and coaxed flame from the frozen air. The fire crackled to life, painting his face in gold and shadow. Maeve crouched near it, stretching her hands toward the heat. "You do this often?" she asked quietly. "Every day? Live like this? Alone?" He looked at her, eyes reflecting firelight. "It's easier than living with ghosts." She didn't ask more. Something in his tone told her not to. He unpacked smoked venison from a leather pouch, handed her a strip. "Eat." She hesitated. "It's yours." "It's ours tonight," he said. They ate in silence, the storm roaring beyond their little circle of flame. For the first time in years, Maeve felt full, not just with food, but with warmth, safety, presence. Afterward, Joe laid out a thick fur for her. "Sleep. You'll need strength." "And you?" He threw another log on the fire. "I'll keep watch." Maeve lay down, the scent of pine and smoke wrapping around her. Through half-closed eyes she watched him, a solitary figure against the dark, coat glinting with snowflakes, rifle across his knees. "Joe?" she whispered. He turned slightly. "Why did you really say you needed a wife?" A long pause, then his low reply, "Because I was tired of being a man with nothing to protect." The fire hissed as snow melted into steam. Maeve closed her eyes, the fear that had lived in her chest for years softening, dissolving, replaced by something new. Not quite love yet, but the beginning of it. When dawn came, The storm had cleared. The mountains stood sharp and blue, and the trail led onward toward the unknown. By noon the next day, the sun broke through the clouds. Steam lifted from the pines, and birds began to sing as if the night's blizzard had never happened. Maeve, riding behind Josiah, could hardly believe the sight that unfolded before her. A valley wrapped in gold and green, a narrow river slicing through it like glass. Nestled against the foot of the ridge was a cabin, sturdy, smoke curling from its chimney, roof dusted with snow. "That's home," Joe said simply. Maeve's chest tightened. She hadn't had a home since she was 10. The word itself felt foreign, fragile. Joe swung down from the horse and offered his hand. "Come on, it's warmer inside." She followed him through the creaking door. The scent hit her first: pine, smoke, leather, and something faintly sweet, like wild honey. The interior was rough but carefully built. Thick logs, shelves lined with jars and tools, a table made from a single oak slab. A bearskin rug lay before a stone hearth where the fire roared bright. Joe set her bag down gently. "It's not much," he said, "but it's safe." Maeve turned in slow wonder. "It's beautiful." While she warmed herself by the fire, Joe poured water from a kettle into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Drink. Heat helps more than blankets." She obeyed, the warmth spreading through her fingers, then her chest. "Do you always live alone?" He nodded. 5 years now." "And why?" He hesitated, then quietly, "My wife and son died. Fever took them. I left the town before it took me, too." Maeve's heart twisted. "I'm sorry." Joe shrugged, eyes distant. "The mountain keeps you busy, gives you something to build, something to fix, but it doesn't talk back." Maeve smiled faintly. Maybe that's about to change. The next days slipped into a rhythm that neither had expected. Joe taught her to keep the fire steady, to mend nets, to set snares in the brush. Maeve, in turn, scrubbed the wooden floor until it shone, learned to bake coarse bread in the iron pot, and filled the cabin with small sounds, the hum of a tune, the laughter of discovery. When Joe caught her humming one morning, he looked up from the chopping block and said, "Haven't heard music in this cabin for a long time." Maeve blushed. "It just helps me work." "Don't stop," he said. "The place sounds alive again." At night, they sat by the fire sharing stories, his about mountain storms and wolves, hers about the streets of Dublin, the sea voyage, the way loneliness could stretch wide enough to swallow a person whole. One evening, as she sewed a tear in her skirt, she said softly, "You know, the coach driver wasn't wrong. I am heavy, but maybe that's what kept me alive in the cold." Joe looked up from carving a piece of wood. "Weight doesn't make a person weak. It makes them harder to break." Her throat tightened. "No one's ever said that to me before." He smiled, a real one this time, not just the ghost of it. "Then they've been blind." By the end of winter, the cabin had changed. There were curtains on the windows, a pot of herbs growing near the sill, and laughter tucked into the rafters. The silence that used to press in on Joe had softened into something warmer, filled with the rhythm of shared breath and small human sounds. One night, while snow drifted against the window panes, Maeve sat close to the fire, her hair glowing copper in the light. Joe watched her quietly, the words forming before he realized he'd spoken them. "You belong here," he said. She turned, startled. "Do I?" He nodded. more than I ever did." For a moment, neither moved. Then, gently, she reached out and laid her hand over his. The fire popped, sending a spark up the chimney, and outside the wind changed, no longer biting, just whispering through the trees. Spring came early that year. The snow on the ridge thinned into streams, and wildflowers began to climb the slopes like fire spilling upward. For the first time in years, Josiah Brennan allowed himself to believe the mountain might stay quiet. But quiet never lasts. It started with the sound of distant hooves, not the slow, measured rhythm of a hunter or a traveler, but the ragged gallop of men who rode without purpose other than greed. Joe heard it first, while cutting firewood behind the cabin. He lifted his head, listening. 2 horses, maybe 3, coming fast from the south. He dropped the axe, wiped his hands on his coat, and went inside. Maeve was kneading dough, her sleeves rolled up, humming the same Irish tune she always did when she worked. The smell of yeast and wood smoke filled the cabin. She looked up at once. "What's wrong?" "Riders," he said simply. 3 of them." Her face drained of color. "You think—" "I think the world doesn't like to let good things alone." He crossed to the rifle stand. They didn't have to wait long. By the time the riders appeared at the clearing's edge, Maeve could already recognize one of the voices shouting across the valley. Hank Crowley, the man who had thrown her off the coach, the man who left her for dead. "Well, I'll be damned," Hank called, reining in his horse. "You really did find yourself a new home, darlin'. The whole territory's been talking about the big Irish girl who shacked up with the hermit of Black Elk Ridge." He spat in the dirt. "Reckon you owe me some compensation, sweetheart. That fare wasn't cheap." Maeve stepped to the doorway, her hand shaking, but her voice steady. "You left me to die." Hank grinned. "And you didn't. That makes us even." Behind her, Joe stepped forward, rifle cradled against his arm. "You've had your say. Now leave?" One of the other men laughed. "Hear that, Hank? The beast thinks he can order us around." Joe's eyes didn't move from Hank's face. "You've got 10 seconds before I make good on the name." For a heartbeat, the clearing held its breath. Then Hank sneered, kicked his horse, and turned. "You'll regret this, Brennan. Ain't a man in town won't take my side once I tell him what kind of woman you're harboring. Filthy stage rat, that's what she is." The men rode off, leaving churned snow and a promise of trouble behind. Maeve's knees gave out, and she sank to the floor. "He'll go to the sheriff. He'll tell him I ran off with you, that you kidnapped me." Joe crouched beside her, taking her hands in his. "Then we tell them the truth." She looked at him, her voice breaking. Men like him don't care about truth. They care about stories that make them powerful. He brushed a stray curl from her cheek. "Then I'll remind them what real power looks like." That night, neither of them slept. Maeve sat by the fire, watching the shadows twist and flicker across Joe's face. Finally, she whispered, "I should leave. If I stay, they'll come for you." Joe turned toward her, slow and deliberate. "You walk out that door, and they win. They'll think they can still take whatever they want. But if you stay, they'll learn there's a line they can't cross anymore." She swallowed hard. "I don't want anyone to die because of me." Joe's gaze softened. "I already died once, Maeve. When my family went into the ground, you brought me back. I'm not letting anyone take that from me again." At dawn, smoke rose from the valley. The signal fire from town. Joe loaded his rifle and strapped on his revolver. Maeve reached for his arm. "Promise me you'll come back." He cupped her face, thumb tracing the corner of her mouth. "I will, because now I've got something worth coming back to." Then he rode down the mountain into a storm that wasn't made of snow this time, but of men, rumors, and the weight of old sins. The town of Silver Hollow sat quiet under a gray sky when Josiah Brennan rode in. Smoke curled from chimneys, dogs barked behind fences, and the blacksmith paused mid-swing at the sound of hooves. People whispered when they saw him. The solitary man from the mountains, the one who rarely came down unless the world had pushed too far. He tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and pushed through the swinging doors. Inside, Hank Crowley was already there, hat in hand, feigning humility. Before Sheriff Mills, a man more politician than peacekeeper. "I tell you, Sheriff," Hank was saying, "he stole her right off the trail. A paying passenger, mind you. Whole town's been worried she's dead." Mills leaned back in his chair. "That true, Brennan? You take this man's woman?" Joe's voice was steady, low. "She wasn't his. He abandoned her in the high pass and left her to die. I found her, fed her, gave her a roof and a name to live under." Hank's smirk widened. "A name to live under, huh? Sounds like a fancy way to say wife without the wedding." The room went still. Joe's hand twitched near his belt, but he forced it still. "We were married, by our own word and by God's. That's more than I can say for you, Crowley." Hank spat. "You think anyone's going to believe a murderer and a fat girl with no papers?" Joe's eyes flashed, gray steel catching light. "Careful, Crowley." The sheriff raised both hands. "Enough. I don't want no blood in my office. We'll settle this at sundown. Bring the woman here, Brennan. Let her speak." When Joe returned to the cabin, Maeve was waiting on the porch, her face pale but resolute. "They want me to come," she said before he could speak. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." She squared her shoulders. "They won't believe you unless they see me, unless I stand there myself." Joe studied her for a long moment, pride and fear tangled in his chest. "Then we go together." By dusk, half the town had gathered on Main Street. The saloon emptied, the blacksmith's forge cooled. Word had spread. The mountain man and his Irish bride were coming down to face Crowley's accusations. Maeve walked beside Joe, her green dress simple but clean, her hair braided tight. The whispers began before they reached the sheriff's steps. "Is that her? Poor thing. Big girl like that won't last a winter up there." She ignored them all. For once, she didn't look at the ground. Sheriff Mills stood before the crowd. "Mrs. Brennan," he said carefully, "this man claims your husband forced you to stay with him. Is that true?" Maeve's voice rang clear. "No. He saved my life. Hank Crowley left me to die. If not for Josiah Brennan, I'd be bones in the snow." Crowley stepped forward, face red. "She's lying. But Maeve didn't stop. "He treated me with kindness, with respect. When every man here would have looked away, he didn't. He gave me a home, and I'll spend the rest of my life repaying that with love." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Crowley snarled and reached for his revolver, too fast, too loud. But Joe was faster. His rifle rose in one smooth motion, the barrel glinting in the evening sun. "Don't," Joe said. Crowley froze, staring into eyes that had seen more graves than mercy. The sheriff stepped between them. "That's enough, Hank. I've heard enough. You're under arrest for attempted assault, abandonment, and perjury. The crowd gasped. Hank tried to protest, but two deputies grabbed him, dragging him away as he cursed into the dirt. As the people began to scatter, the sheriff looked at Joe and Maeve. "You two head on home. This town owes you more than it'll ever admit." Maeve turned to Joe, her voice trembling now that the danger had passed. "It's over?" He nodded once. "It's over." But she shook her head softly. "No, it's beginning." She reached for his hand, and together they walked toward the fading light, leaving behind the road where she'd once been abandoned, and walking toward the mountain that had given them both back their lives. The trail home was quieter than it had ever been. The wind no longer howled through the peaks. It whispered, like the mountain itself had exhaled. Maeve rode behind Josiah, her arms looped lightly around his waist, the scent of pine and smoke rising from his coat. The town was far below them now, the noise and cruelty of it fading into memory. When they reached the cabin, the first thing Maeve saw was the faint glow through the window. The fire Joe had built before they'd left, still alive, still waiting. She smiled. "It's funny," she said softly. "When they left me on that road, I thought my life was over. Turns out it was just beginning." Joe helped her down, his hand steady at her waist. "Sometimes the world's cruelty is just God's rough way of setting you down where you belong." She turned toward him, eyes shimmering. "And where's that exactly?" He brushed a stray curl from her cheek. "Right here." The days that followed were quiet, gentle, the kind of peace that feels earned. Maeve filled the cabin with the rhythm of living, bread baking, floorboards creaking, laughter echoing against the beams. Joe fixed the roof, hunted game, and started building a cradle from cedar wood. It was Maeve who noticed the change first, the way her dresses grew tighter, the way her body softened with a secret she hadn't dared hope for. One evening, as the sun set gold across the ridge, she took Joe's hand and placed it against her belly. He froze, eyes widening. "Maeve." She smiled through tears. "Looks like the mountain decided we'd waited long enough for company." Joe dropped to one knee, resting his forehead against her. "You've given me back everything I thought I'd lost." Maeve cupped his face. "No, Joe, you gave me life. I just carried it forward." As spring turned to summer, the valley bloomed in wild color. The river sang louder. The air smelled of new beginnings. Sometimes travelers would pass by, trappers, riders, mailmen, and they'd tell stories of the big Irish woman and the mountain man who burned a rumor to the ground and built something honest from its ashes. Maeve would just laugh when she heard it. "They make it sound like a legend," she'd tell Joe. He'd grin, eyes soft beneath his brimmed hat. "Maybe it is." One evening, as the stars began to rise, Maeve stood on the porch, her hand resting over the gentle swell of her belly. Joe came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders, the warmth of him solid and sure. She leaned into him, voice barely a whisper. "Do you ever think about that road, the one where they left me?" He nodded. "Every time I look at you." "Why?" "Because that's where I found you, and where the mountain gave me a reason to come back home." Maeve smiled, tears tracing her cheeks. "Then I suppose I should thank them." Joe's voice rumbled low like distant thunder. "No, thank fate. It knew what it was doing." The night wrapped around them, the fire glowing through the cabin window, the crickets humming in the grass, the stars bright enough to see forever. The woman who had once been left behind now stood where the world ended and something better began. And the man who had once sworn to live alone had found that solitude wasn't peace. Love was. They say the mountains keep their secrets, that once the wind carries a story up through the pines, it never truly leaves. But some tales deserve to echo forever. Maeve Sullivan, the girl left behind on a frozen road, didn't vanish. She was found, not by luck, not by pity, but by a man who saw her worth when the world refused to. And Josiah Brennan, the solitary hunter who thought his life had ended with grief, discovered that love can rise again even from the ashes of loss. Their story isn't about rescue, it's about recognition, the kind that looks past scars, past shame, past the cruel weight of words like too much or not enough. Because love, the kind that endures storms and silence, doesn't measure beauty in pounds or perfection. It measures it in courage, in the strength to stay, to build, to begin again when the world has already written your ending. So, if you've ever felt left behind, remember Maeve. Remember the sound of that stagecoach fading into the distance, and the horse that came after it, carrying a man who said just 7 words that changed everything. Good, I need a wife. Somewhere out there, between loss and hope, someone is looking at you the same way, seeing what no one else bothered to see. And you, wherever you are, whoever you are, you deserve that kind of love. Now tell me, where in the world are you hearing this story from tonight? And do you still believe that even the lost can be found?